and welcome to Feelings Matter, brought to you by Mindful Ampy and NAMI Central Texas. We are going to jump right into this week's topic. This week, we're going to be talking particularly about workplace culture and mental health by asking the question, how are you really? So, Karen, can you kind of give us a little bit of context around why that question in particular? Why is it we frame this as how are you really?
Yeah, well, great question. And I love that you started with that because the reality is that we live in a culture in which we throw that phrase around all the time. How are you doing? How's it going? And our response typically is like, it's good. It's fine. Like we don't it and how often do many of us ask the question and then we're not even really waiting for the response because we're just used to the response. The response is always, I'm good. We're good. And so I think that question really implies that slowing down enough to say, no, how are you really? And I know I actually use that with people now all the time when I, do that. I've asked, so how are things going? Pretty good. And then it's like, no, really. I'll sometimes even lean in. No, really. How are things really going? Because then you've sort of created the space where you say, no, I really want to know how things are going. So it's an invitation. I think it's an invitation to slow down. And I do think whether it's in our community, in our homes, in our workplaces, one of the reasons we don't talk about mental health sometimes is because we're just too busy. We're focused on the next thing that we are doing. We forget that we're human beings, not human doings. And it requires us to slow down enough to have these really rich and important conversations. Conversations about mental health sometimes are not conversations that you can have really fast, right? So it's really important to slow down.
Mm-hmm. I want to get into the first part of one of our discussion questions, and Tina, by all means, feel free to jump in when we are not petting puppies. Hello, puppy.
I'm jealous.
But we've kind of set this context of okay, we are aware that mental health is definitely something that is part of our lives in the workplace. It's okay to talk about it. There shouldn't be a stigma around it, but so how do we actually, because I know a lot of people kind of get hung up with okay, I know there's an issue here, but now I'm concerned about maybe addressing it in the wrong way. We
Mhm.
get hung up with making judgment calls in advance of asking the question. So how do we check in, particularly with our coworkers? Let's start with kind of the in-person for those people that do have an opportunity to see their coworkers face to face during the workday.
Mhm.
How do we go about checking in and asking somebody, are you okay? How are you
Mhm.
doing today, without feeling like I'm about to make a huge mistake and make this problem worse?
Yeah, I think those are great questions. And first of all, I think I want to go back to what you just said because I want to clarify that for those of us that are comfortable talking about mental health, we feel like it's okay to talk about mental health. We absolutely ought to be doing that. And I think it's really important to recognize that not everyone feels that way. Like we all, I think, internally recognize we should be okay with talking about mental health and we should strive for that. But I don't think we're all there yet. And I think that's part of the culture is we really have to change that in workplaces, at home, everywhere. And so, one, let's just start with that. Secondly, what you're naming is being in a workplace setting in which you've definitely, and I say this, how important this is to recognize when there's someone that you know pretty well and you've just noticed a change. Because I can give you a list of signs, things that you might see. But I think for most of us, sometimes it's just this nagging pit in our stomach, something that says, something's not quite right. And we talked about this last week, about the value of pay attention to that inner voice that tells you something's going on. So, one, that happens. And now you're recognizing, I really feel like I need to talk to this person. And if you're at work, it might be a situation in which there's a lot going on. So, there's not an opportunity in that moment to create the space that we just talked about, because that's critically important. You can't have a conversation like that when there's a bunch of people around or when you're hurrying and you've got like 2 minutes to really allow that person to respond to that. So if that's the situation, you want to create the space for that and say, and I really encourage a lot of I language. hey, I've noticed that things aren't really okay lately. Maybe after work or maybe later we can just find some time to chat. Like, I'd love to really check in and see how things are going. I think, and you will notice in the way I asked that, it was again a lot of eye language, but really full of empathy and compassion. You can even hear the way I said it, that says, I want to create safe space for you because I care about you and I want to have this conversation. And I think that's key. So choosing the right time and place is really important. Are you the right person? Maybe you are, maybe you're not. Maybe you've noticed something in someone else, that's a colleague, but maybe you're not really very close to that person. So that might be a situation where you might reach out to another colleague and just say, hey, I've been a little worried. I don't really know that person really well, and just sort of flag that for someone else. Or if you feel like, again, do you feel like you feel comfortable having that conversation, then by all means have it. But being sensitive to the fact that maybe you're not the right person, I think is really important. And then, sort of being prepared to be uncomfortable, I think is important. I think so often we go into those conversations and we're not really thinking about the fact that you're creating space and someone might share something that's really vulnerable, difficult, something that might even be triggering for you. So sort of being ready for that conversation. And I think one of the other ways that we prepare ourselves is by knowing what the resources are. And I really want to challenge everyone that regardless of whether it's colleagues, again, family, friends, neighbors, whoever it is, we should all know some of the resources around mental health that are available to us, whether those are national resources or local ones in your community. Get to know what those resources are, put them on your phone so that regardless of the situation, you're always ready to have that conversation and say, hey, I know somebody we could reach out to. Here's a great resource that I know about. And how important that is, because I also think it's a value to recognize that you don't have to have all the answers going into those conversations, because I do think that's part of what keeps people from having those conversations is the fear that I'm going to say the wrong thing, do the wrong thing, I won't have the answers. And so it sort of feels like if I don't know what I'm doing, then I shouldn't just bring it up at all. And I really want to discourage people from that. It's like, you don't have, leave your cape at home. You don't need to be the superhero and save the day and have all the answers. And in fact, you will be a better source of help if you actually come into it vulnerable, with the ability to listen well and to have those resources. So I covered a lot there, but
Yeah, that I know I've been wanting to go back and kind of piece through some of the different components, because you mentioned about right person, right time, right situation, right place. There's so many things to consider when you're thinking about, how you check in with somebody in a way that helps them feel safe to express themselves. And then kind of wrapped up with the fact that, we generally have a need to like, if I'm not going to provide value or fix everything, then why bother even engaging in the conversation? So there's that too. It's a lot. I mean, what do you think, Michelle?
Well, I hear what you're saying, and I definitely want to draw out because you said right time, right place. Sometimes you don't have the option of, can I talk to this person face to face? All of my engagement is remote. Does that affect how we check in with somebody? And I'm totally willing to say, hey, I may not have the answers, but I want you to know that I see you and I care about you. Do you need to just vent? Because I'm here for that too, if that's what you need.
yep, absolutely. And I love that because honestly, both of you are just approaching this from a place of empathy, which is, I think, is key to all of this. Is really approaching it in the way like, how would I want to be addressed in this situation. And so I loved what you raised, Michelle, in terms of what if you're not face to face? Because for many of us, we're not having that opportunity to have those kinds of engagements. The one thing that I think is really important to recognize is that. Most of our communication is, we tend to think because we're communicating, we're saying things, that most of our communication is verbal, but so much of how we absorb information and communication is physical. It's the way people sound and the way they look when they're speaking. So I would say this. I do think that if you want to reach out to someone, it's a whole lot better if you have to be virtual, that it is this video piece of it, or at least a call where they can hear your voice. Because if you send someone a text, a message of some kind that's written or an email, they're going to hear it through their own lens and perspective. And if people aren't doing well and they're struggling, they may very well read some judgment into it where there isn't any. They may not hear the empathy and love and concern and compassion in your voice. So I do think you've raised an important point, which I do think it's always better if at least hearing the person's voice. So calling them up and saying, "Hey, I've been thinking about you, and I would really love an opportunity to chat with you." Whatever, however you want to phrase any of that, right? And then ideally, being able to see the person. So if not face to face in real life, that at least that's a virtual call that you're having, because it changes everything. It will change it for you as well if you're the person making the call, because then you see the person's face also. And sometimes that's how we recognize what people are really communicating, the depth of their pain or struggle, or that they're telling us, "I really am okay. Like, it's been a rough week and things are hard and I'm glad you checked in, but I'm okay." And sometimes people will say that and then you see their faces and you're like, I'm still a little concerned, right? So I do think that there's a lot of value in that.
Mm-hmm.
What else? What are you thinking, Tina? So you're shaking your head just then. What was that?
That was that's a common one that I've seen, because I am the type of person that perceives a lot when somebody's not doing well, and I will just ask them, "Are you doing okay?" And then, or "Is there anything I can do to support you?" And then they kind of give me like, "Yeah, it's been really hard, but I'm doing okay," and then they kind of blank out. But what that may signal to me is that it's not the right time or place,
Mhm.
or maybe I'm not the right person. So I will back off
Yep.
when I get that signal, and I will respect that, like, I'm not ready to talk about it right now.
Yes.
And understand that those are one of the, because I think it's easy to say it has to be the right time, right place, but it's hard to know what that really means. And what that
Mhm.
really means is, doesn't really hurt to ask, but if you get a
Yes.
signal that their other person isn't comfortable, don't push it. That
Yes.
means it's not the right time
Mm-hmm.
or place, and
Yep.
that's how you
Mm-hmm.
can practice empathy, but not bulldozer empathy, right?
Yes. Yes. I love that, Tina. You raise such a valuable point, and I often say that to people, that sometimes you have to be prepared that that person isn't ready to have that conversation. And then all you have to say is, "I'm so glad." And just know, like, I'm here. If the time ever does come along where you want to talk about anything, or like, I'm here for you. Just know that. Because I think it's also important to recognize that sometimes, Tina, you can ask the question, and because of where that person is, how they're feeling, they may also express anger or frustration or annoyance with you and be like, "What are you asking me that for?" And so you have to be prepared for that as well, and understand that that is that own person. Sometimes when you feel like someone has seen you, it feels so good. It's like, "Oh, you saw me." But sometimes when you feel like someone has seen you, it's like, "Oh no, you saw the mask," and it makes you feel really vulnerable. And so people will sometimes respond in that way. Sometimes it is a negative sort of response. And I think, again, coming at that place of empathy, which you just named, which is to say, "Great, I'm glad you're doing okay. Just know that I'm here." Or if that person does respond negatively, say, "Hey, I wasn't trying to upset you in any way. I care about you, and I thought I'd noticed something. And if at any point in time, like, you want to talk, if there is something, just know I'm here." But to your point, that may not be the right time for that person, or they may not feel like you're the right person for them to talk to. So I love that, again, you're just approaching this from a great place of empathy. I feel like that has so much to do with the work that you do with
Mm-hmm.
Mindful Appy, because so much of that is about being perceptive, and not, I think so often there's a tendency on our part to project on other people, to sort of make assumptions about where we think they are or what we think is going on, and how important it is when we talk about creating safe space, that it's about stepping away from any assumptions, any judgments, any preconceptions about what's going on, and really allowing yourself to listen. And I think our human nature is, we're oftentimes not the best listeners. And you know what? We can't help that, because our brain works faster than our mouth does. So if someone is speaking, your brain is processing what they're saying much faster than our typical speech patterns, right? So our tendency is to begin to already process solutions, ideas, responses. And so being an active listener is so much harder than it sounds, because it really does challenge us to slow down and really be able to listen in such a way that you could literally repeat what the person just said to you. Um, I feel like I'm often guilty about that. So sometimes I try to keep a notebook handy, like, or just a piece of paper where I will jot down if an idea comes into my head or something pops into my head, so that I jot it down, so that I'm not allowing myself to get distracted by that, or that I'm not interrupting, because that's the other thing sometimes we do, is we do a lot of interrupting, so people don't get to finish their thoughts. So yeah, I love that you're bringing all of that up, because I think it's easier said than done to do what we're saying, which is creating that culture of really listening and safe space. It's challenging. It's not easy to do,
It's
because it kind
hard.
of goes against us.
It
Yeah.
takes a lot of practice, and it is almost one of those mindfulness practices where you almost, or meditative, that's what I've thought of it like, to try to encourage myself to practice active listening, is to try to keep like, oh, this thought's coming up, and then remind myself I don't need to solve, I don't
Mhm.
need to offer solutions, I don't need to make suggestions, I don't need to correct, I don't need to judge, I just need to be present and listen. And then even if you can repeat back exactly what they said, maybe you don't even have anything to add, and that's still okay. That just to know that you've been heard is often nice.
Yeah. Yeah. I think being heard is something that we all long for. And it's so powerful. And I think also just being there is also, I think sometimes we diminish the importance and value of just being with someone. One of my favorite scenes when we talk about the power of being someone when with someone when they're struggling is that Inside Out, the Pixar movie, the animated movie. Do you remember that scene where Bongo's wagon goes off the cliff? And Bongo is so sad, and he's sitting there and he's just so sad. And Happiness comes over and it's like, hey, hey, everything's okay, trying to make it all better. And then Sadness just sits there with Bongo and is just this presence in the midst of all of that. And that is what helps Bongo move to that place of healing and acceptance and being able to get up and say, okay, I'm ready for the next thing now. And so do not underestimate ever the power of, like you said, you don't have to have all the solutions. Sometimes if you're just there for someone, and that ability to repeat what they said and to say, tell me more, and creating that space can be, oh, so powerful, so healing for people, because we all long for that in this really busy go 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 time where it feels like we're getting drawn by so many things. That's exactly what a lot of us sometimes need during this difficult time.
And even practicing getting comfortable being there when somebody is not, when they're in a very negative or low emotional state, they feel depressed, or they feel
Mhm.
self-conscious or sad or guilty or ashamed or angry, and not letting that, taking their emotions personally. Do you know what I
Mhm.
mean? Like
Yeah.
letting it spill over to you, like, well, oh, they're angry, it's getting me all angry, or they're sad, it's getting me all sad. It's just the more that you can just honor where they are and be comfortable sitting with it. It's really hard to do sometimes, even when you practice it for a long time. And just to be present, it's like looking into somebody's eyes and making eye contact for a really long time. It's uncomfortable.
Yes.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Um,
One of the things I want to address is how a power dynamic might
mhm.
affect this a little bit. So while coworkers can reasonably have a conversation on equal footing, how does this translate when it's a team leader or a manager or somebody with a perceived higher level of power, higher level of influence? What does a leader need to take into account when checking in and offering support, not just to an individual, but even to their entire team?
Yeah, great question, because I think there is definitely a nuanced difference in that, right? And I think you're naming something that as we talk about shifting the culture, I think it's really important to recognize that um, we have to have a sense of sort of psychological safety in our work environment. And a lot of times when we think about psychological safety in the workplace environment, we really talk about people feeling comfortable, pushing against, whatever the norm is and saying, I don't agree, or those kinds of things. But I think we need some psychological safety around mental health as well. It's interesting when I do this training with workplaces around how are you really, creating this kind of environment. I always kick it off at asking people like, why are you not comfortable talking about mental health at work? Like, what is it? And pretty consistently, people name stigma. They name fear. I'm fear that I'm going to be perceived differently. They name judgment. And I feel like all of those are pretty valid because sometimes people have had an experience where they feel like they thought they were safe and then they weren't. So I would say to leaders and managers that you need to be very intentionally creating that psychological safety in your workspace that tells your team, I, this environment, and I, as your leader manager, are a safe space. I think leaders don't recognize the power they have to help transform culture simply by talking about mental health themselves. Like nothing is more powerful than a leader saying, whether it's from their own lived experience, to be able to say, listen, I've been navigating, depression my whole life, or there's a history of mental health issues in my family. So I totally understand it. And I want to create the safe space for people to talk about this. Some of this also happens with policies. What are your policies in your workplace? Because I think that often says a whole lot more than anything that comes out of your mouth. So, do you have PTO and you encourage people to go on vacation, but then when they go on vacation, you're texting them and you're emailing them, and so therefore they feel like, oh, it's actually not really okay for me to take time for myself. What are the messages that you're sending? Do you have mental health days? So many workplaces in the midst of the pandemic, which I'm excited about, are moving towards that, are really naming whether that's mental health days or just letting their teams know, hey, mental health is health. So if you have a day where you need to take a health day, whether it's mental health or physical health, you have a cold or your anxiety is just really high, whatever that is, take the time. We want you to take care of yourselves. So you can say all kinds of things, but if you've not created that space, your team is going to know that and they're going to be more hesitant about talking about that. So I think that's, first of all, is figuring out, have you created that psychological safety around mental health? And then that other piece is, being able to, again, name the concerns that you have in a way that also comes from the same space of empathy, compassion, understanding, knowing what the resources are, using that I language, creating space, using the same kinds of conversation starters where it's just saying, listen, I know you. And I know that you just seem like you haven't been quite yourself. And this is not about performance or productivity. This is about you as a person. And I'm coming because I'm a little bit concerned. And I think one of the things leaders and managers can do right now is extend and express a lot of empathy for their teams, recognizing everything that the pandemic has done to all of us, being able to name that, communicating that with your teams and saying, listen, it has been a difficult time. We're seeing increases in the number of people who've been impacted in terms of their mental health, not just in our, among our team, but nationally all over the place. So we know this is a concern and we want you to know that, naming what the resources are and, making sure folks know about their EAPs or whatever it is, the resources that you have internally, and being ready to name that then. So if you have already created that space and you're communicating, that helps create that foundation for a really healthy and productive conversation when you're concerned about someone on your team.
Mhm.
And then really creating that space to say, I am concerned and how can I support you in this? And I think that's really important as a leader or a manager, not coming into the space with all the solutions. Because I think, Tina, you talked about that. Like so often that's what we do, right? I've got this all figured out. Here's what you need to do. But really, again, stepping back and saying, how can I support you once someone has made themselves vulnerable? Maintaining the confidentiality around that. Because I think nothing's worse for that psychological safety is that if at some point in time everyone finds out that something's going on. And I think whether that's any kind of health issue or any kind of, issue that someone's having, if someone has made themselves vulnerable and then discovered that you've shared it with everyone, so recognizing in your role that you need to maintain that confidentiality and to express that, not because it's something to be shameful, but because we owe each other a certain level of respect, that you get to tell your story. No one else gets to tell the story of what's going on with you.
Mhm.
So I think the first thing is really creating this space in the workplace that becomes foundational to that. You're communicating that through your policies, through the way that you're reminding folks about what the resources are, through the way that you're talking about the fact that these have been difficult times. Are you changing policies around? I've seen some folks do that, where taking half of Friday off and just telling everybody, hey, for the whole month, everybody's just taking Friday off. We don't want you to answer it to emails or text or anything. I think I mentioned this the last time about a company that I got an email from them where they literally have it in their signature line that says, we're a company that believes in work-life balance. We don't respond to emails after this hour law. You know, wow. If you work for a company like that, that says everybody puts this on your signature, you already know then that they value your mental health, that they're creating that space for that. So I think we've got to start with things like that.
This also makes me think about more like accountability and corporate policy. Maybe you've got a really good leader that is empathetic and is really good about communicating, but then they're feeling pressure around completing performance reviews, around other KPIs and things where the company leadership is saying, yeah, but you still got to do this stuff.
Mhm.
How do you continue to implement that? When do you need to lead up and say this policy around, say, performance reviews needs to change because it does diminish the level of psychological safety that I want to create with my team? How do you balance those sorts of things?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I do think you're right. And I've actually seen this in at least one company that I worked with, where you did have leaders and managers who were great and extended that empathy and all of that. But the company at the more global level clearly was not there. So then you had someone else that had a completely different experience and in fact ended up leaving the company because of that. In their vulnerability and sharing and asking for a slight accommodation, not a big accommodation, a pretty slight accommodation to address what they were experiencing, they found themselves losing responsibility and essentially sort of being demoted, and they left the company. A really great employee left the company because someone else approach that in a different way. So I think you're naming something that's critically important, which is, especially when we talk about bigger companies, like that has to be company wide. And it really is. That's where the other part that leaders and managers play is so important, which is you have to be that voice for that kind of change. One of the things that I'm seeing in a lot of companies, and more use of employee resource groups, which I think is fantastic, because it's really sort of this grassroots movement that's happening in companies where those employees are saying, hey, this matters, and being a voice for that kind of change. And so I think whether it's groups like that or leaders themselves stepping up and saying to the company, hey, I'm concerned because this is what I'm seeing. And here's the great news for leaders and managers, team leaders, supervisors. There's some great data out there that you can point to where you can say, look, let me show you. Us not addressing mental health in the long run, the cost of that is so much higher than us being proactive in creating that kind of space. I think McKinsey and Company is a great, they're a great website to visit. They do all kinds of studies. You can visit them. Deloitte has also done a lot of great studies around workplace and culture and mental health. So there's some great data and statistics and information and studies that you can point to say, we need to be focused on this, because the reality is that workplaces that are better equipped to address mental health and that come at this from a place of empathy are actually more successful and more productive. One of the trainings that I do is around empathy, and there's a whole bunch of case studies around there. Around empathy, and that some of our most successful companies here in the United States are companies that measure high on that level of empathy scale. Because the reality is that employees, when they feel like they are heard and supported, we're just human. Like, any place where we are, if we feel like we're heard and supported, we're just going to be more loyal. We're going to work harder. We're going to feel like we have the tools to be successful. And so there's a lot of sort of bottom line, sort of economics behind this approach. It's not just
Mhm.
a feel good thing. And I think that's important. As we talk about this feelings matter, let me be clear that they matter as humans, but it matters in terms of the bottom line business as well. You want to
Right.
thrive and be successful as a business, you better be paying attention to the feelings, the emotions, and the mental health of the people that work for you. Because if you're not, guess what? They're going to leave. And the reality is, we're seeing this exodus that's been happening. Like, I think it's something like 40% of people like switch jobs in this last year. And I think a lot of it is folks had more time to think about this. And I
Mhm.
will tell you that millennials, they're naming mental health as one of the top things for them. So if you're worried about retention and recruitment and talent acquisition, you had better be shifting your culture and paying more attention to feelings, because feelings really do matter in the long run. Not just because we're people, but because we're
Mhm.
people who work, and we
Sure.
spend the biggest chunk of our time every day working. So
Well,
get
and
off
you
the
give me
soapbox about that.
you give me the right reason to ask. So, okay, if this matters this much, if it does impact the bottom line, um, how can we collect this data? How can we use it as data? Because especially at the global corporate level, we've got to have some quantifiable something to justify making a huge change. So how does collecting emotional feedback and quantifying it play a role in all of this?
It's interesting, but going back to what I just mentioned about McKinsey and Company and Deloitte, like, I've read some of the studies that they've done, and I think it's important to recognize that we know that there's this gap that exists. Like, employers have all of these benefits that they're offering. So employee assistance programs and all these, access to gyms or whatever it is. So from their perspective, it's like, hey, we're fully supporting this. Like, we're doing all the right things. And yet employees, when you ask them, still think that, oh, no, there's still too much stigma. I still don't feel like my workspace is psychologically safe for me to talk about mental health. So there's a definite gap there. And I definitely, there's a couple of studies that specifically mention the fact that even just collecting that kind of data to see how folks are doing says to employees, you care. Like, you're checking in, you want to know what the temperature is of the company. You want to know how we're doing. And so I do think that that data has value in helping raise that sense of psychological safety, because what it says to me is you care enough to be checking in. I think doing periodic surveys, and I was sitting on a panel last week where it was with a bunch of HR folks, and one of them said, well, we can do surveys, but the problem is a lot of times leadership says, well, we don't want you to ask these things, because then if we can't do anything about it, then, well, yeah, you're right. But I think that means you need to be doing something about it. And I think sometimes we can do surveys and be able to say openly and honestly, like, we're not going to be able to address all the needs and everything that's important, but we are listening, and we're going to continue to strive to make the kinds of changes that matter. But that's one of the reasons I love the work that's being done with Mindful Appy, because that's really about taking this sort of confidential, anonymous, sort of checking in to see how everyone's doing. So I think that creates more of this potential for people to be more honest about what they're experiencing. And I think when we're doing these periodic check-ins, it tells us, hey, is there any shift? And I think what it says to employers is, hey, we're still seeing that folks are struggling. So let's figure out what that is, and do we need to be talking more about some of the resources that we have? What is it that we need to be doing? And are these the times when we need to be engaging in surveys with our employees, or focus groups, or checking in? Because again, at the end of the day, the bottom line is that this matters to folks. They need to know that you care enough to ask how they're doing. I mean, that's just my perception. I'm curious. I mean, what you guys think about that?
I couldn't agree more. I mean, it's like just it matters, and I think asking the question is what's important. To your point, when you ask somebody a question and you really listen to the answer, it helps people feel heard.
Mhm.
And, some of the things that we're working on is not just asking the question about how people are feeling and getting that data, but then following it up with another question, which is, what are you doing? What are you doing to make this better? And what are you doing to make this better? And what are you doing to make this better? And what are you doing to make this better? And what are you doing to make this better? And what are you doing to make this better? And what are you doing to make this better? And what are you doing to make this better? And what are you doing to make this better? And what are you doing to make this better? And what are you doing to make this better? And what are you doing to make this better? And what are you doing to make this better? And what are you doing to make this better? And what are you doing to make this better? And what are you doing to make this better? And what are you doing to make this better? And what are you doing to make this better? And what are you doing to make this better? And what are you doing to make this better? And what are you doing to make this better? And what are you doing to make this better? And what are you doing to make this better? And what are you doing to make this better? And what are you doing to make this better? And what are you doing to make this better? And what are you doing to make this better? And what are you doing to make this better? And what are you doing to make this better? And what are you doing wow, how can I support you in your work? What is it that you need, that you're missing? So helping prompt managers and leaders to ask questions that are open-ended, that invite discussion, that invite people to self-disclose, things that they might not have otherwise disclosed if they don't have a very safe environment, because it's not like you can snap your fingers and go from no psychological safety to psychological
Yep.
safety in one day. I think what we
Mhm.
see is it's a process,
Yep.
and it's something that happens over time with slow, measurable, regular nudges that slowly over time can help change behavior. When a manager starts asking open-ended questions about what they can do to support, and they start getting answers, and hey, maybe they try something and they see positive results, they might do it again. And then over time, they may
Mhm.
learn, by behavior modifications, that they can show empathy, even though they may not have ever thought they even had it. Because a lot of people will think, oh, empathy, I don't know. I don't even have empathy. It seems so obtuse. I can't get my head around it. But
Mhm.
I don't know. I think it's something that can be practiced.
Well, and
Absolutely.
Tina, if I could, can you go a little bit more specifically into how mindful appy provides that nudge and begins to shift to a much more psychologically safe, as well as providing people with the data they need to start making these changes?
I can. And it goes back to one of Karen's early comments about the right place, the right time, the right person. So with Mindful Appy, we ask a question. It could be every single day. And you know what? People may not answer it every day. I don't answer it every day. But sometimes you're going to catch them at that moment when something has happened and they really are like, yeah, huh. Yeah, actually, I'm kind of frustrated right now. I may be a little skeptical. I'm going to put in my
Mhm.
little skeptical button because you caught him at the right time. But it's just the consistency of asking time over time over time that trends eventually emerge from that. So it's not a point in time. It's a continuum, and I think that reflects our
Yes.
own human experiences as we operate on a continuum. We're constantly fluctuating and changing, and to think that a survey or a one point or one data point is adequate in understanding how people feel is about as reliable as thinking you can do a focus group of one and get all the information you need. I mean, you really do need to look at how it changes over time if you want to even begin to think about understanding emotions at scale.
I love everything that you just said, Tina. And in particular, what I want to circle back to that I think is so important to just state again is that we are talking about culture shifts in the workplace, and they are not going to happen overnight. And just because you do one thing is not going to, I mean, it is a series of things, this continuum that you talked about. And so I think it's critically important to recognize that, because otherwise it's easy to get frustrated and feel like it's not going to work. A study that I looked at last week was saying that it will take 2 to 3 years for a company to be consistent around providing training. And let me be clear that I'm big on this piece as well, which is we have to be training managers, supervisors, leaders on things like empathy, because we can sort of think we know what it means, but we having that training to really understand what is active listening. I talked to a bunch of communicators earlier this week thinking, oh, like they know this stuff because they're communicators. Like that's what they do for a living. Boy, their response to everything that I was sharing around active listening, like, hey, can I have that slide? I jotted all that down, because we all struggle with that. So I think supporting your leaders and your supervisors and your managers, so doing that ongoing training, doing that ongoing checking in and the surveys, and being able to, as a company, sometimes it means being vulnerable to say also, like, we recognize we're not where we need to be, but we're trying to move in the right direction, and we're moving together in that direction with you, and we are listening to you, can be really powerful. And it will take time. So, but I think one of the things that we know that can be critically important is the data. So that's things like mindful appy. It might be like surveys. And then really, I was working with a company a few weeks ago where they did this survey, and I really challenged them to look deeper at that because I felt like they were missing something really big in this, which they have both hourly employees and salaried employees. And one, they didn't have a whole lot of their salaried employees that participated, but it looked like of the salaried employees that participated in that, this was a company that had lots of extra benefits around wellness. They weren't participating in those. And part of what they were saying is, we're working a lot of hours. We don't feel like we can take time off. We don't feel like there's that opportunity. So I think it's not enough to just do the surveys, but you also have to be willing to get uncomfortable unpacking some of that information and saying, where's the gap here? Yes, we have hourly employees that we need them here to do specific things, but are we creating them space for them to also take the time off that they need? Are they feeling as valued so that they're practicing wellness as well? So lots of sometimes difficult questions, difficult conversations that we have to be having in the workplace. But I think in the long run, so important. And I think employees then feel, again, like they're being heard and supported. And it can totally transform a company when employees feel that way.
I'm taking just a moment to share the link to the NAMI Central Texas Workplace Mental Health Training. It's in the chat. It's in the show notes. Can you tell people a little bit about what's on offer as maybe a first step?
Sure. And thank you. Thank you for sharing that. So, we're doing a whole plethora of, they're not actually even all on the website, but a lot of times what I try to do is just sit with folks to find out exactly what they're looking for. Interestingly enough, a lot of companies tend to start with the managing stress. I do that quite a bit. It's a nice doorway because everybody feels it. So one, there's a need there, but then it's a nice transition to be able to talk then about mental health. And that's usually where I land at the end of that, like talking a lot about some of the strategies and practices, and then helping people to understand. And then how do you know when it's not more than stress? Like, what should I be looking out for? A lot of companies will also start with, how are you really? Because I think it's a great place to start. Because if you're at a place already in your company where people want to talk about mental health, I just provide some real practical tools and tips for doing that. We're also covering topics like managing anxiety. I'm going to be with a company tomorrow where we're talking about anxiety, because that has been something that their employees have talked a lot about feeling like they're at sort of this more anxious place. And so providing, again, just some real simple tools for navigating that. But we also have opportunities to bring in conversations around suicide and, empathy is a really big one as well that I just did also a couple of weeks ago with a company. So lots of different kinds of topics. And most of them, the really cool thing about them is the topics have really developed sort of organically. That was my listening to companies. Instead of coming up with a whole list of things that I thought companies ought to be talking about, I started listening to them and finding out, where did they feel the gaps were? What were the topics that they felt employees were really needing and wanting to talk about? And so we've developed a lot of workplace training around those topics as well.
Cool. Tina, is there anything you want to say as we wrap up here today?
Oh man, it's another great discussion, and I just really appreciate getting to have these conversations with you, Karen. So awesome.
Yeah, me too. I think that these are really valuable conversations, and I hope folks heard something that they'll find helpful, and that they know that we both exist, both the work that we're doing in the training, but also the work that you're doing in terms of really providing a tool for folks to start paying attention to the data and listening to their employees during this, again, really difficult time where folks need that. They need to be heard and supported.
Absolutely. I'm glad we're all working on that together.
Yeah, me too.
And I think that is a perfect place to stop and thank those of you that are watching and listening. And we hope that you have a great week.